Hello, hi, welcome. My name is Steve Hewitt. I'm in the Department of History at the University of Birmingham in the UK, where I am right now at this moment. I run a Twitter feed called Terrorizing History, which reflects my interest in the history of terrorism, the history of counterterrorism, lots of other things, security intelligence, surveillance, all those sorts of things. And this is one of a series of interviews I've been doing with historians who've done work related to terrorism, political violence, whatever you want to call it, and have written about it. And it's a chance for me to talk to them about their work, but more generally about their career, and also about ideas around the study of terrorism, political violence, the history of it, and all of that. And I'm very pleased today to be joined. It's very early where he is, because he's on the West Coast of the United States, to be joined by Dan Chard, who's the author of this newly released book, Nixon's War at Home. It was published by the University of North Carolina Press in the autumn of 2021. And Dan teaches at Western Washington University in Bellingham, in the great state of Washington, and he's here today. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Steve. So glad to be speaking with you.
So tell us a little bit about your background. What's your story? How did you get here?
I grew up in Connecticut in the United States, and I'll just give you the academic part because I'll give you a little bit more of my background in the next question. But I got my PhD in history, in U.S. history and world history at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst in Massachusetts. I did my undergraduate at the University of Southern Maine in history. And then here at Western, where I've been since 2018, I teach courses on U.S. history, Pacific Northwest history, Cold War, U.S. and international terrorism, and I'm also an active member of my union, the United Faculty of Western Washington University. Great.
And I mean, how did you get interested in the subject of political violence, which you obviously, I mean, this book was many years of hard work on your part.
Sure. Yeah. So in between that academic work, that I mentioned, I've been involved in radical movements or movements of the left of various kinds and in various capacities since I was a teenager in the
as an activist.
Late 1990s. Yeah, and I was really part in the late 90s and early 2000s, part of kind of the anarchist wing of the environmental movement, anti-war movement, global anti-globalization or global justice movement, Anyway, I was also involved in doing political prisoner support work for incarcerated people in the United States who had come out of some of the movements of the 60s and 70s, including some leftist guerrillas. So I visited, former members of the Weather Underground and Black Liberation Army in prison, and people from other guerrilla groups, and I'm still friends with some of them today. And so that led me when I decided to go back to school at the University of Southern Maine to finish my undergraduate degree. I'd originally gone to a Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven is where I went right after high school, and then I dropped out. But when I went back to school, I was in studying history, and then eventually going to graduate school. I was really interested in kind of studying these groups, but I wanted to kind of look at the question, and the people other scholars have already kind of looked at the motives, like why people got involved in these leftist guerrilla groups. I wanted to look at the question of like, what did they actually accomplish, or how did they actually influence American politics or the state, beyond the radical left. And eventually I started looking at FBI documents, first FBI documents on the Weather Underground that are in a microfilm, down in the microfilm library. And I started seeing the word terrorism pop up, and, coming in a post 9/11 era, looking back at this, and then also coming from being in part of these movements that there had been some FBI surveillance, there'd been some FBI targeting and framing environmental radicals as terrorists, particularly actually here in the Pacific Northwest, where there've been some political arsons happening. So I realized, wait, what I'm seeing here is some sort of a nascent counterterrorism.
Right.
And so that's how I got here. And, you know, and along the way, I also had to confront some of my earlier like romanticization of some of these leftist guerrilla groups. But I still in the book really try to still,
Yeah,
you know,
you strike a balance in the book. Yeah. 'Cause, I mean, at times you're quite critical of those groups, and I think the book offers a lot of nuance in terms of the FBI response, and you actually challenge some of the earlier scholarship that you see as being too perhaps simplistic in terms of either portraying the FBI, you know, as all powerful, or the American state is all powerful, but or you know, the FBI sort of it's more complicated in a sense in terms of some of its motives, and also you know, portray the infighting that's going on as well between Hoover and some of his deputies, and I mean that's fascinating as well, that detail. But we'll talk more about the book in a second. I'd like to ask this question to historians, because it's one of my own personal pet peeves, which I always mention, which is the way that this subject is frequently dominated by disciplines that aren't called history. I'm just wondering, what do you think as a historian you bring to this topic that perhaps a political scientist wouldn't have brought?
Yeah, you know, I want to say there were some, I do think that history and theory can complement each other when they're done well, but I think there's been some work by social scientists, including people like Lisa Stampnitsky and Gildas Wehrman is less well known. There's been work on leftist guerrillas, Donna Della Porta, but also on leftist guerrillas. But the you know, a lot of work, especially by those who are kind of working for or advising the state or trying to figure out like problem solving for law enforcement, it tends to be just like not looking at motives, not looking at context, not looking at the broader, you know, change over time. So anyway, I think as historians, what we do is being able to look at things in context, using primary sources, understanding motives of various people, but also unintended consequences, how, you know, what the guerrillas wanted to achieve and what the FBI wanted to achieve. Neither one of them really happened, and it turns into something else. And then and understanding how these fights that we might think of as terrorism are related to much larger political changes and events and political economy.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, as we talked about earlier, that I think historians often bring a lot of nuance into subjects that are much more complicated sometimes than the way they're framed by other disciplines. As you said, the context is often quite important to understand. You know, why things are.
Yeah, and it's exciting. I mean, that's part of the reason I was really excited to do this interview is because I'm really interested in thinking about you know, terrorism history or counterterrorism history as a field, and then how does it relate to this other terrorism studies or to history? I do think we bring something really important that's often still gets ignored, and I'm hoping we can be less ignored in the field of terrorism studies. You know, especially now. I think there is, especially with the Cambridge history of terrorism, which I've started reading. You know, we can come back to that maybe later.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, well, let's get into the book. And by the way, I should add, I think it's my internet is sticking a bit, so I apologize if there's any sort of delays. But as I said to Dan before we started recording, we're just going to push on regardless. So tell us a little bit about the book. You mentioned already some of the sources in terms of relying on FBI documents, but tell us a little bit about the book, you know, what you see as your main arguments, and more on your sources, etc.
Sure. Yeah. So the sources include FBI documents from many different places. I mentioned microfilm. There's some materials I got from the Freedom of Information Act. There's materials from the Nixon Presidential Library, from various digital sources, Marquette University archives, and the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And then I also, use memoirs and other stuff from leftists too. And so, some oral histories of FBI agents, not that were conducted by others. So those are the sources. There's two big arguments to the book, and there's some sub-arguments, but the two big arguments, the first big argument is about the origins of counterterrorism. And in a lot of popular understanding in the United States, people think of counterterrorism as kind of starting as a response to the 9/11 attacks, September 2001, of course. And I'm arguing that counterterrorism started earlier, and maybe we'll get into discussing periodization in the field later, but I'm arguing that it specifically starts in the 1970s, counterterrorism. We have America's first institutions explicitly dedicated to fighting terrorism. And that's happening as part of the FBI's war with these domestic leftist guerrilla groups like the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army. So some of the kind of sub-arguments, connected to that big argument about the origins of counterterrorism is that this book is examining a shift in American national security priorities from anti-communism to anti-terrorism. It's looking at how the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover begins to revive illegal surveillance practices that had been used widely against the Communist Party in the Second Red Scare in the 50s and early 60s after World War II, but he had actually banned in the mid 60s, warrantless wiretapping, break-ins, male surveillance, use of underage teenage informants. So reviving those, developing new police tactics, including the first use of undercover FBI agents, joint law enforcement task forces dedicated to fighting this kind of violence, contingency plan for hostage crises. You also have mass surveillance of political and racialized suspect communities, including in terms of political, we're talking about the left, the Black Power movement, racialized, talking about Arabs and Arab Americans in the United States. And then especially after the Munich attacks in 1972.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating part of the book in particular. The targeting of, because obviously there was that huge targeting of Muslim Americans after 9/11. And then you see this sort of parallel going on after the Munich attack.
And we can dive into some of that more. And so in terms of some of the other parts of this development of counterterrorism, part of it is that I'm arguing that counterterrorism has always been political. It's existed in a particular political economy. So it developed in response to leftist guerrillas who are trying to end the war in Vietnam and racist police violence. But it wasn't dealing with those latter causes. It was not
the wider root causes. It's not addressing. It's addressing in a sense the symptoms, but not the causes.
I don't use the term in my book, but since in some of my discussions since, and even reading some other literature, thinking about it as a form of just basically crisis management, is a way to think about it. But also that it's been limited. It was limited in its effectiveness and often counterproductive and led to unintended consequences. Which brings me to the second big argument and piece of scholarly contribution here is it's looking at how the bureaucratic conflict within the FBI and between J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and his loyalists and the White House, the Nixon White House, that bureaucratic conflict over how to deal with this leftist guerrilla violence is part of a story that previously hadn't been told about the origins of the Watergate scandal.
Right.
So it's some of the flashpoints include, of this conflict include the response to Weather Underground's accidental explosion that kills 3 of their own members in March 1970 in a townhouse in Greenwich Village, New York City. Young Black radical Jonathan Jackson, his armed siege on a courthouse in Marin County, California, August 1970, and a bombing at University of Wisconsin by white anti-war radicals the same month. Black Liberation Army starting a campaign of assassinating police officers in May 1971, and then the Munich attacks by the Black September faction of Fatah, Palestinian nationalists. So all of those lead to these flashpoints in this struggle, and ultimately, Richard Nixon J. Edgar Hoover is willing to start to unofficially bring back some of these illegal surveillance practices under pressure from Nixon in response to some of these events. But he's only willing to go so far. He's not willing to use his agency for the kind of just straight up partisan political activity that Nixon wants him to use. And so Nixon forms his own set of operatives, the plumbers. And that's who gets caught breaking into the Watergate complex in the summer of 1972. So, and, leads to the fall of the Nixon presidency. So we can dive into any of that more, or I could, talk about some of the earlier stuff in the book about kind of my new look at the counterintelligence programs, COINTELPRO. But that's the basic overview of the main scholarly contributions.
Just a quick question about the sources. I mean, how did you approach those police sources? I mean, because I asked this as someone who's heavily relied on police documents, and obviously you always have to be careful with them in terms of how you treat them, because they often provide, I think it's, sometimes there's a tendency, obviously, to treat them as if they're the gospel truth, when obviously they are a constructed truth. And the other thing related, and this is a question that I've struggled with in the past, is so many of these organizations that police are spying on are also being spied on by informants, and sometimes the informants are involved in running the organizations or creating the documents. And there's the false narrator, where it's like, or unreliable narrator, in terms of we don't fully know how extensive the involvement informants were sometimes in these organizations, and how much the informants steered groups in certain directions. You talk a little bit about the use of, or the spreading rumors of informants as a way of sowing divisions with the Black Panthers and other groups in the book. But how did you tackle those police documents in terms of dealing with them?
Yeah, I mean, just like any other source, as a historian, we have to look at them critically and with a degree of skepticism. I guess what was interesting to me is when I started looking at these documents on the Weather Underground, and even including counterintelligence documents, it was just amazing to see how much they're really saying that they are responding to violence and concerns of violence. And in some cases, certainly, and I talk about this, J. Edgar Hoover gets up in November 1970 in front of Congress and he's overstating the degree of leftist bombings. And on one hand, early on, Weather Underground talked about wanting to do bombings with civilian casualties. That's what they were planning in March 1970, but they scaled it back. But the FBI didn't totally know that. They really were concerned. But so there is Hoover always exaggerated, whether it was communists and espionage or leftist guerrillas, to get more funding and to keep building the FBI. But they really were. There really was this crisis, and it's not just that they want to protect people and save lives, but it's also like their reputation as professionals is at stake. Who wants to be? We've seen even with January 6th, why wasn't the FBI prepared? Right after 9/11, why wasn't the FBI prepared? No one wants to be the person on whose watch some attack happens and people get killed. So everything I had heard about COINTELPRO kind of coming up in these radical movements, a lot of it came from the scholarship of Ward Churchill, who's really done so much damage. I really hope people just stop citing his books on the FBI. They're just so, Athan Theo Harris, who's an FBI historian, reviewed the first book, Agents of Repression, back in the early 80s. And then in the Washington Post, and said that they didn't provide any of the evidence to back what they claimed. But anyway, and then they came out with another book and just, anyway, and they've still been really influential. But all kind of their argument is just like, COINTELPRO was just all about the FBI seeing these groups as a political threat, and that the repression they faced was all like a reflection of that. And of course, they had the FBI had and J. Edgar Hoover had racist biases. They had they're no friends of the left, but they didn't go after all groups the same just based on their views. They really in the late 60s and early 70s, as Hoover was getting old, was worried about leaks. trying to be careful about what they did, so it wouldn't undermine their own reputation if leaks got out, that they were doing illegal activity. And of course, that's what ends up happening anyway.
Yeah.
And
I would think one of the fascinating things in the book, and I think this sort of cuts to the heart of why some people find the whole discussion of terrorism problematic, and that's around terminology. And as you rightly point out, I mean, until before the 70s, the word terrorism was not consistently deployed by states. I mean, you mentioned that sometimes it was used interchangeably. I know Timothy Naftali mentions this in his book as well, that they used, when the US was talking about Vietnam, they sometimes used terrorism to describe what the government of South Vietnam was doing, and it wasn't used consistently. And I've seen this in my own work as well, that it changes in the 70s for various reasons, including what you cite in the book and the Munich attack and all of that. I want to ask you, though, about your choice to use instead, you've used it a few times already in the interview, but to use the word guerrilla instead. I mean, what was your thinking in terms of using that word in the book? Yeah,
sure. I mean, that's what they called themselves, guerrillas. They were looking, I mean, the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army and, many others of the left were influenced by their whole political strategy really came from Che Guevara.
Right.
Guerrilla means, as means little warrior or little war. You're instead of you're using so you're not doing conventional warfare. You're trying to do hit and run attacks. And so they saw themselves as that, and they are really informed by the idea of urban guerrilla warfare that comes from Carlos Marighella, and this idea that in the context of the anti-colonial movements of the time, that they could have a guerrilla unit operating in the US that would maybe bring the heat off of Vietnam, off the Black liberation movement, and they could somehow with what help bring down American imperialism, overextend it from within. So it was used. You start seeing the term terrorism in the FBI documents more after the townhouse bombing, and then you start to really, and then you start to see it, and then the Houston plan, which was this effort to create the first, it was a secret effort by the Nixon administration working with some officials in the FBI in 1970 after that bombing, to try to consolidate all the power, all the different federal intelligence agencies under the direct command of the White House, and bring back all those illegal surveillance activities. And then Hoover sabotages it because he sees it as an affront to his turf. But one of the things I'm trying to look at here, and I'm drawing again off of Lisa Stampnitsky's work, her book, as some of you watching just know, and I hope you'll interview her on here sometime, is Disciplining Terror: How the Experts Invented Terrorism. Yeah. So, and some of those theorists in critical terrorism studies have talked about terrorism being a social construct. So I'm looking at how, there's always been different insurgent violence. So I'm looking at how that becomes framed as terrorism, and the implications of that for understanding the constellation of power and shifting power relations, and how terrorism becomes this.
So would you use the T word at all then? I mean, for instance, if you look at the Klan in the 1960s, you wouldn't call them guerrillas, would you? Or insurgents? Would you call them?
You call them clans, white supremacists, and certainly terrorizing people. But it wasn't people. This whole conversation is, I think, a post 1970s and a post 9/11 conversation about whether we should use the term, because at the time, saying the Klan or white supremacist violence was enough to indicate that this is illegitimate, it's scary, it's terrifying, it's awful. It just, that wasn't the, I'm sure it was used some mixed in with the other terms, but it just, terrorism prior to the 1970s did not have a connotation of this existential threat to Western civilization and American civilization. And I think it's since 9/11 in the United States certainly is so wrapped up in the war on terrorism and honestly racism against Muslim, racialized Muslims and Islamophobia. I don't think it can be separated from that. Or so I think so. Yeah, I mean, what do you think? What do you tell me? You decided this is a question you wanted to ask right in the middle of the interview.
Yeah, it's just interesting because one of the things that struck me if you think about the Weather Underground, and I'm going to be teaching about them in a few weeks, is it's a kind of a strange guerrilla movement when they're avoiding any kind of casualties for their attacks. They're doing this symbolic sort of bombings, and it's like, how are you going to bring about a revolution? I mean, I don't know whether revolutionaries would be a better word. I've been currently working on chapters in my own work on the FLQ who are active in the same period, who are also doing, like in 1963, they're blowing up statues and they're blowing up mailboxes because it says Royal Mail on, and they're trying to avoid casualties. And it's sort of symbolic violence that's targeting colonialism. I mean, they called themselves revolutionaries. And the government of Canada, the Canadian state, occasionally used the T word, but also called them revolutionaries, called them murderers, used different words. Yeah, it's one of these questions again. I mean, I've talked to Richard English about this, who's sort of gone full circle. I mean, I think Dan and I were on a panel with Richard that Richard kindly chaired in Belfast, and I don't even, when was that, 2018?
Yeah, it was. It was like April, spring 2018. Right before
and I don't remember, I don't think Richard mentioned it there, but I mean, in his book on the IRA, he doesn't use the T word at all, but he's come full circle because his argument is if historians don't use that word, then we shut ourselves out from having any kind of sort of say in the debate that goes on. Yeah, it's, I don't know that there's, I like the term political violence, but I also see that states do terrorism as well. And I think we need to talk much more about state violence and view that as terrorism as well. And then we get into, is it about violence that targets civilians? And yeah, there's no easy answer. I just found it really interesting. And I think I would say courageous on your part to use that sort of terminology. I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, are we going to call Henry Kissinger a terrorist too? I mean, and then you know,
he was responsible for more deaths than the Weather Underground.
Absolutely. I mean, this, yeah, or you know, just yeah. So, in terms of, you brought it up, so I'd love to add to this because I think thinking about this as a field of terrorism history, I think that's an interesting point about being left out, but of the field if we don't use the term. And I do think, you know, we were emailing before this, and I've been, like I said, I've been reading. We just, with my students, read Richard English's introduction to the new Cambridge volume on terrorism, and I just read your essay, kind of looking at historiography or early historiography of counterterrorism and its possibilities. And I think that, and I'm thinking about this question of periodization and even like, is there a field, you know, when Beverly Gage wrote her article, her State of the Field article on terrorism in American history, there was in Journal of American History, there was a bunch of respondents, and some people said, is there even a field? Can we say this is a field? Terrorism history, like, but I think that the 70s is a crucial turning point. And if I think, you know, in terms of constructing it as, and even developing what's called explicitly counterterrorism, I do think you've made, and Richard make convincing arguments of like antecedents or precedents, or, you know, in terms of in other early insurgent attacks within liberal democracies of using, you know, use of informants, unintended consequences, the response, going beyond the thread and leading to other political changes. I think we just have to be really, and I think that can be fruitful, but I think we have to be really careful and qualified if we're going to use the T word, because it is anachronistic and it is pejorative. It is pejorative. It is political and it means something really specific now that it didn't mean then.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I mean, again, I think as you're right that we need to qualify when we discuss it and use it. some of it, again, I just don't know that there's a better word, but yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting debate. Trying to think what I was going to ask now.
Yeah.
I mean, you brought up 9/11. Do you think your book has, I actually, I know what I was going to ask you, which is also about the Cold War,
Yeah.
because I mean, you're right to say that there are some changes in terms of like dealing with hostages, that the FBI brings in FBI agents going undercover, but so many of the methods, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, that they use against the Weather Underground and the BLA are methods they were using against American communists, the use of informants in particular, and COINTELPRO and all of that. I mean, to me, in many respects, the war on terror is an extension of the Cold War, at least in terms of domestic security. And I don't know, what did you think? What do you think of that point? I mean, you do talk a bit about the Cold War in the book.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of my arguments is that, and you know, I'm building off here off of others, including Mahmoud Mamdani's like brilliant book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And you know, he's saying we have to understand 9/11 not as a culture talk clash of civilizations, but as a product of the Cold War and a product of US interventions and covert operations and proxy wars after Vietnam. And so, but I think like even going back, looking at the origins of counterterrorism, similarly comes out of a Cold War experience, both from, you know, multiple sides. I don't want to just say both sides, but from the guerrillas, like I said, there's part of a shift, you know, starting with the Tricontinental Congress in 1967 in Havana with leaders of leftists and the Third World Movement. There's a split, you know, and Vietnam is a big part of that. Like, do we pursue political change through communist parties and socialist parties and the labor movements, and you know, and then trying to get nonviolent, you know, diplomacy through the UN so we can have a separate bloc outside of the two major powers? Or do we follow the Vietnamese example and the Fidel Castro's version of the Cuban example and pursue guerrilla warfare? And that was appealing to some people in the United States, especially when they're dealing with the slow pace of change, police violence, and you know, it was an ideology that seemed to show a strategy. And some people at the time said that's a crazy strategy and we shouldn't do it, or they started questioning it as they went along.
Yeah.
So, but then from the state, yeah, they're using some of the same methods. There's even a debate about what's more of a threat, communism or terrorism, you know, and you know, people like oh, why am I forgetting the name of the chief domestic, the head of the domestic security?
Was it not Sullivan? Not Sullivan.
Yeah, William Sullivan is saying,
Yeah.
he's the head. He's the main person within the FBI who's going with Tom Houston behind Hoover's back. He's saying Hoover's not taking the threat of terrorism seriously, you know, and he uses leftist guerrillas sometimes too. So it definitely is a product of the Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, I think
see some of these antecedents from prior.
Yeah.
Insurgency and counterinsurgency.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the 70s is almost the beginning of a transition from the Cold War to the new sort of war on terror. Because there is that, you're right. I mean, there is this sort of notion that suddenly with 9/11 that these police agencies are having to do things they've never done before, which is completely, it's nonsense.
And in fact, you know, I talk about it after that. One of the reasons the U.S. so the first agency that explicitly dedicated to fighting terrorism is the Houston Plan, 1970. And as I mentioned, that gets torpedoed in this bureaucratic conflict. And that's a big part of like the first big flare up also between Nixon and the FBI that kind of sets Nixon on the road to Watergate. So the other one is after Hoover's death in May 1972, and then after the Munich attacks, September 1972, you have a new cabinet organization formed called the Cabinet Committee to Combat Terrorism. And it really has limited powers. And I argue that part of the reason for that is probably because the Watergate scandal was already underway at this point, and Nixon did not want to try to do another power grab. But it gave the FBI basically all jurisdiction over anything that was considered a domestic terrorist or a terrorist attack inside the United States. And then, but it mostly formed as Lisa Samnitsky documents, a form of funding for terrorism research and kind of a clearinghouse sending some information to the White House about different threats that might be going on. But I argue in the mid to late 1970s, really after Watergate and after the Church Committee hearings on FBI and CIA wrongdoing and illegal activities and all the shock that engenders after the war in Vietnam, Americans are really more concerned about government overreach than they are with the handful of leftist guerrillas that are still operating in the US. And you have new ones by this time, including the FALN, Puerto Rican independence guerrillas. But it's really after the Iran hostage crisis and then Reagan coming into power that you start to have formal counterterrorism institutions set up, and many of them are, you know, set up by people who had been anti-communist warriors and segregationists, like Strom Thurmond plays.
That's really interesting in the book, his role.
Yeah.
That was surprising.
Yeah. So they, you know, so yeah, it's in the 80s. But one of the things I point out too, so the first joint terrorism task forces formed in like 80, 81 are in New York, Chicago, and then the third one in 1983 is in Boston. And those are all set up to go after some of these leftist guerrilla groups that are still around and operating at this time. And those then proliferate after 9/11. I mean, they expand later in the 80s and into the 90s, but by after 9/11, they're in every single field office of the FBI. So yeah, a lot of people don't realize that you know, institutionalization of counterterrorism is still in a large part response to some of these leftist.
And one of the important points I think you make in the book that brings us to 9/11 is this notion after 9/11 that one of the reasons 9/11 happens is because the CIA and FBI had one arm tied behind their back because of things that happened in the 70s with, you mentioned the church already, which is, I think, as you point out, is bonkers basically. But that argument really holds sway that, you know, that these agencies were gutted by Church and Carter, and then there's some restrictions by Clinton in the 90s in terms of informant recruitment, because I think there was an informant in Latin America who was involved in killing civilians that was working for the CIA. But yeah, this sort of myth develops that, you know, this is why they couldn't stop 9/11, or part of the reason was because they couldn't get informants or there's restrictions.
Yeah, well, anti-communists and people on the right have been making that argument all along. Strom Thurmond, you know, how as we know, is well known for, you know, his long filibuster against the, you know, earlier versions of the Civil Rights Act, and one of the first, you know, senators to switch from the Democratic Party in the South to the Republican Party. He does that to support the Nixon campaign. Like, so he holds, there's kind of this leftover relic of McCarthyism, the Senate Internal Security Committee. He's kind of by himself holding throughout the 70s these hearings on terrorism, and a lot of the experts that he brings up are these anti-communist, I mean, kind of cranks, you know. But that creates that's kind of this dissent against the different reforms that are being put in place under Attorney General Edward Levy, and in response to the Church Committee hearings. And then after the Reagan Revolution, and then, you know, this is landslide election and Republicans taking over both houses of Congress, Thurmond becomes head of the Judiciary Committee, taking the part which had, well, I think, anyway, he becomes head of that, and then they create a new Senate subcommittee on terrorism, and it's basically just that old leftover McCarthyist Senate committee with a new name, and that becomes so they had been calling for like getting rid of those restrictions all the way back to the Houston plan. So that's not something new. But the other thing I point out, like, if we're going to have a historiography of terrorism and counterterrorism, we have to acknowledge that in the US, at the same time that counterterrorism is really being institutionalized and politicized by Reagan. Reagan is exporting terrorism to Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. You know, straight up like textbook definition of terrorism: non-state actors, So there's some, bankrolling the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet-backed regime and the Soviets, and the fight against the Sandinista revolution.
In the Contras,
Yeah.
the Contras,
Yeah.
and them targeting civilians, which
Yeah.
obviously if the Soviets had sponsored the Contras, Contras would have been
Yeah.
labeled as terrorists. But
Exactly.
yeah, exactly.
So yeah, and I think that's what a lot of some in the social science field don't want to hear
Sure.
about.
Yeah. Any final thoughts about the book?
Well, I just thank you for inviting me on here, and I hope people read it. We didn't get into each chapter, the different narratives, but I think it's pretty a good read, and if you're interested in movements of the
very
60s,
accessible.
Weather Underground, I hope people will check it out.
And what are your future plans? What are you working on now?
Yeah, the next book is going to be about American counterterrorism between Watergate and 9/11.
Okay.
So I've talked about that a little bit. That's what I'll say for now. But
Right.
you and I will talk about it more.
Sure.
It'll be fun.
Thank you so much. This was great. And I hope people who watch it will find it very illuminating. And again, it's Nixon's War at Home. It's out in bookstores now, and I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody watching.